You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
This week on From Embers, we're going to be speaking with John Clarke, who is a founder and longtime organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty in Toronto. OCAP has played a key role in the anti-poverty movement here in Ontario for nearly 30 years, deploying a creative variety of militant and confrontational tactics in the interest of meeting the immediate needs of poor and working class people. Their motto is Fight to Win, and they were one of the first political groups that inspired me back when I was a teenager living in Toronto. When I moved to Kingston, the Kingston Coalition Against Poverty was very active, and I think my first political action here in town was a march that went to the private home of provincial politician John Garretson, where we had a community barbecue and a game of frisbee on his front lawn. Last year, John retired as a paid organizer of OCAP, although he remains an active member. We spoke about the history and philosophy of the organization, various campaigns and actions OCAP has undertaken over the years, how the context has shifted under various provincial governments, and what he believes is in store for the future of social movements here in Ontario.
For 28 years, I was an organiser with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, and in January of last year, I stepped down. I'm still an active member of the organisation, but no longer one of the organisers.
Okay, and would you be able to tell us a little bit about your backstory coming from the UK and immigrating to London?
Yes, I came from the UK as a young man in the late 70s, actually, and I moved to London, Ontario, and I was active in a trade union. I was working in the Westinghouse plant in London. Got laid off and found myself involved with forming a union of unemployed workers in that city. And the LUUW was active for a period of about 7 or 8 years. In 1989, we worked with people in various other cities on a march on the Ontario legislature that led to the formation of OCAP. So in 1990, I moved to Toronto to take up the job of organizer with OCAP, and I've been with OCAP ever since.
And when you were in London at the Westinghouse plant, that was the United Electrical Workers?
Yes, it was.
And they were sort of one of the more socialist unions still left in Canada at that time, weren't they?
They were. They had a long history. The Canadian UE was separate from UE in the United States, but they shared common roots. And one of the more radical unions that had been around, that sort of traced its history back to the great explosion of union organising in the 40s, in the 30s and 40s, that led to the formation of the CIO. So, and the UE retained some of those traditions. Subsequently, it merged with the then CAW, later Unifor.
Okay. And so in shifting your focus from trade union work to unemployed work, was that just a matter of your personal circumstance, or was it stemming from an analysis of the capitalist conditions, or how did you decide to do that?
Well, it's certainly true that my personal circumstances, being an unemployed worker myself, is what was sort of pretty vital component of me taking that stuff up. But at the same time, I was really fascinated by the concept of that part of the working class population that finds itself unemployed or thrown into conditions of poverty, and the notion of trying to organise that part of the working class as part of a broader working class movement in alliance with trade unions. So I saw it as working class organising, but a component of working class organising that hadn't had enough attention paid to it. And of course, there's the incredible record of earlier struggles, particularly in the not entirely, but particularly in the 1930s. So there's a long history of trying to organise poor people's movements, unemployed workers' movements, associations of homeless people, and those kinds of things. And I saw that as an area of work that was really important. And indeed, when I had the chance to go back to Westinghouse and go back to that job, I chose to stay as an organiser in the what today perhaps we would call the anti-poverty movement, and saw that as my priority, and it remained my priority.
I'm not the most familiar with that history, but is this like Francis Fox Piven's Poor People's Movements, and were folks kind of talking about that as a sort of guide for how to proceed?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because Piven and Cloud's works on poor people's movements and their analysis of the welfare system and that kind of stuff has had a big impact on OCAP's work. Probably, it's fair to say that initially the group of us that got things going in London and then later in Toronto with OCAP weren't initially aware of Piven and Cloud and their writings. We were more perhaps drawing on the examples of the movements of the 1930s. But the basic, when we came across Piven and Cloud's work and with their proposition that the main way in which poor people can have political influence is through, as they put it, their ability to create crises by disrupting institutions, so that kind of disruptive collective action style, while we'd already started down that road, Piven and Cloud's writings were pretty influential in terms of sort of like crystallising our thinking and refining our practice a little bit.
And so you said that OCAP was founded in 1990, is that right? It had a founding convention?
November 27th, 1990 in Toronto.
And there's a story on the OCAP website about how there was a split at that convention over how to proceed in terms of whether OCAP would be a more lobbying organization or whether it would engage in more direct action in confrontational politics.
Yeah, that's entirely right. We so the founding conference was quite large. I think, as I recall, there was perhaps 150 people there or so. We had a sharp debate around what kind of a model we wanted to adopt: the sort of the concerned citizens, lobbying, public education approach, or a poor people's organisation that would have a direct membership of people affected by poverty and that would use collective action techniques and social mobilising to try to develop some political power for poor people. I mean, we had a debate on the issue, but it also came down to the choice of who would be elected as organiser. I was the candidate for the collective action side, and there was a candidate for the more respectable lobbying approach, and so it came down to. So the thing was decided by who was elected. So I was elected as the organiser, and as I recall, a large chunk of the room at that moment got up and walked out, and probably did the right thing because we'd made a clear decision that we were going to go down a particular road.
Another thing, about 1990 is the OCA crisis happened through the summer of 1990. And OCAP, I think one thing that's remarkable about OCAP is that it's always had a sort of anti-colonial perspective and has always engaged in solidarity with Indigenous land defense, whether that's at Six Nations or Tyingannega or elsewhere. Was the OCA crisis part of the discussion or part of the context at that time?
I mean, certainly it was being, people were very aware of it, and we were discussing it, and it helped to frame our thinking in terms of the kind of organisation we needed to be. But having said that, quite honestly, it was very early in our history, and we didn't have the kind of connections and sort of developed perspective that we would develop later. So there wasn't much in terms of our intervention and our solidarity work around OCA that I could really point to that developed later. But certainly it was an incredible event that set its mark on our thinking.
And of course there was the Ontario Common Front, which was a province-wide, I don't know if the word's network or federation, that linked a number of groups across Ontario. Was that always part of the idea of OCAP? And how did that sort of shift in the first few years of its founding?
Yeah. I mean, the Ontario Common Front came a little later. By the time the Harris Tories were in power in the mid-90s. The idea initially with OCAP after the big march was that we would be a truly province-wide organisation and almost a kind of a federation of local poor people's organisations. We'd expected to, because the march was supported very strongly by the NDP caucus at Queen's Park and supported by a number of trade unions, and we'd expected to be in a situation to have a lot more resources than we ended up having. The NDP was elected, took a fairly conservative turn, and that included a reduced appetite for anti-poverty organising. So we found ourselves without the resources to maintain the kind of province-wide initiative that we'd originally thought of, and found ourselves much more forced to focus on organising within the Toronto area. But while we didn't build that province-wide organisation as such, we did make links with people in other cities that were organising on the same issues, and the Common Front reflected that. It really reflected the fact that we could form a bit of a working alliance with organisations in other cities. And we think particularly of Kingston and Sudbury and such like, some very, very important organising. Kitchener, bringing people into a sort of a united effort to try to challenge poverty.
So was part of the idea, because the Bob Rae government, for those who don't know, was elected in 1990, the same year that OCAP was founded. They were ostensibly left-leaning social democratic government that a lot of people ended up feeling betrayed by. But was the goal at first to kind of work with the government to push things in favor of poor people during their reign, or to hold them to account to follow through on their promises? Or what was the relationship like with the NDP at the time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The NDP came to power and was elected on what they called an agenda for people. And that included a number of important proposals. They certainly intended to raise social assistance rates very significantly. They said they would end the need for food banks. And we certainly saw ourselves right from the beginning as independent and certainly not there to be a public relations front for the NDP government. But on the other hand, we also recognised that we would support progressive measures that they put forward. But we didn't have much opportunity to do that because, unquestionably faced with a major economic downturn, they chose to take a very conservative turn and moved in really regressive directions. I think many members of the NDP today would not disagree that the Rae government was a huge disappointment, moved very seriously to the right. We were one of the first organisations to begin to challenge them, but by the time it was over, there'd been major trade union mobilisations against them and such like. They took really, really regressive directions, going to the extent of freezing social assistance rates and hiring hundreds of investigators to try to police and prosecute poor people on social assistance. and even they even launched a speaking tour to promote this crackdown on the poor. So they took really right-wing directions that we found ourselves challenging and mobilizing against.
I wonder, like, as far as I've understood OCAP, there's always been ideological diversity. So there's been anarchists, communists, socialists, leftists involved. Has that been a difficult alliance to maintain over the years? And how has OCAP sort of navigated that?
Well, I mean, it's meant certainly some level of compromise. It's meant things that we had to agree to disagree about. It's meant things that we couldn't. I mean, for example, there would be disagreements within the organisation over the question of electoral politics, whether, ranging from anti-electoralist perspectives to people that would work probably on NDP campaigns. And I think the general recognition has been that electoral involvement by OCAP is just not a possibility given the range of views that we have. But on the questions of mobilisation and challenging governments and everything, I think we've been able to find a very healthy working consensus that's enabled people with different left-wing perspectives and numbers of people as well that don't have clearly thought out political positions, but are just angry about poverty, to work together in a really effective way.
And I guess the motto of OCAP was fight to win, or is fight to win, I should say. And the direct action casework has always been the sort of one of the main tactical approaches of the organization. Can you sort of explain what direct action casework is and how it relates to winning?
Yeah, I mean, at different times we've done more of it, and sometimes a bit less, but it's always been a component of what we've done and has remained important. And basically the idea is that we rapidly realised that as an organisation we were rooted in a particular neighbourhood, the downtown east of Toronto, and people would come to us with problems. They were being denied welfare, they were facing eviction, deportation, the denial of wages by exploitative employers and those kinds of things. And it was obvious to us that we couldn't just organise on the broad issues. We had to use collective action to actually defend individual people and families in those kinds of situations. And so we developed this method of working where we use various tactics, but very often in a situation of denial of benefits, we might take a large delegation to the office that was denying the benefits and demand to meet with someone in charge and get the matter resolved. And when you're dealing with bureaucracies, disruptive tactics tend to be very, very effective because bureaucracies, by definition, don't do well with disruption. So it's been an important part of what we've done.
Has it been difficult to avoid the emergence of a kind of service provider dynamic between those who are not directly... of
trying to balance service providing with political action?
Yeah, and how to prevent like a class division from emerging between like organizers and activists and those who are trying to get their immediate needs met like today?
Yes, I mean, the truth is that we've not gone down the road very much of service provision because we've wanted to maintain ourselves as a political action organisation. So, we're not in the process of, people in poverty have very definite needs in terms of services they want to access, and generally speaking, we're not playing that role. So it's not that much of a problem. There is the sort of the advocacy side, if you like, the direct action casework that I just described, but that also involves the participation of the person directly affected in a process of mobilisation. So we have kept the focus very deliberately on political action, and we understand that people go hungry, but we're not collecting up food. That people need clothing, but we're not running a clothing bank, and that's just been the focus that we've made. And so there's always been people people directly affected by poverty have always come to us on the basis of participating in the movement, participating in actions, and that's what's really united us.
So maybe for those who don't remember or didn't live here, can you basically just tell us who Mike Harris is and what the so-called common sense revolution was when he came into power in 1995?
Yeah, well, I mean, given the fact that Ontario is, in terms of its population and its economic base, is such a major part of Canadian society, not to be an Ontario chauvinist or anything, but given the importance of what happens in Ontario, it's perhaps possible to say that Mike Harris was the closest thing Canada had to a Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, in the sense that it was a hard right, austerity-based government that was looking to really massively decrease the role of the state in areas of social provision, looking to cut programs, looking to really take the neoliberal agenda forward massively. And it was also a sort of a precursor of the right-wing populism that's become much more acknowledged and commonplace today. Harris put forward this notion of the common sense revolution, that his reactionary right-wing Bay Street agenda was couched as the kind of sensible thing that the average common person would rally behind. So it was a really interesting formation, a despicable one, but an interesting one. And they came to power with a determined attack on the social infrastructure of the province. One of the first measures they took, which they had promised to do, they weren't hiding it, was to cut social assistance rates in the province by 21.6%. They massively cut the budget of the Ministry of Labour to ensure that its employment standards couldn't properly be enforced, and the most exploitative employers would get a free ride. They attacked healthcare, education. It was a brutal period, and a period of large-scale mobilisation for OCAP and for the broader movement.
Yeah, and one thing I was struck by when kind of rereading through some of this history is how quickly the Harris regime went into action implementing all of these measures, and also how quickly people mobilized in huge numbers against it. So 1995 really sounded like it was a period of a lot of activity, both on the government side and on a social movement side.
Yeah, it was. I mean, OCAP played a big role as one of the organisations that was sort of first out the gate in terms of trying to organise. We held a series of actions. We organised a march from the poor community of Regent Park into the ultra-wealthy community of Rosedale, and went to the home of the Lieutenant Governor, who in the name of Her Majesty the Queen would be signing the welfare cut into effect, and went to his big mansion, and a whole series of things that we did were quite, I think, one of the important building blocks of the broader movement that emerged later, and then finally it led to this huge campaign of general strikes, even if they didn't call them that. Local general strikes that the unions organised on a city-by-city basis, and the movement against Harris was never taken to the sort of decisive levels that it should have been. But I think it made a real difference. It limited the ability of the government to proceed with its agenda, and it was a level of social mobilisation in this province that hadn't been seen for many years before that, and hasn't been seen since.
Yeah, and one of the famous things that Mike Harris said, I can't remember the exact words, but he made clear that he was not going to respond to protests, and he had written everybody off as special interest groups. So what was the strategy in terms of trying to put pressure on a regime that made it so clear that it was unwilling to listen to protest?
Well, I mean, the strategy that was adopted was to organise large-scale actions that involved profound economic disruption. So the days of actions involved strikes that brought whole cities to a standstill. They were enormously important, but the problem was that the escalation of that movement to a level that could actually challenge the ability of the government to proceed was something that there wasn't much appetite for doing. So they had an important effect, but they didn't stop Harris, and I believe they could have done. I think the result of Harris implementing the bulk of his agenda and passing the torch over by the Premier that replaced him briefly, Ernie Eves, to a Liberal administration to quietly and more sedately consolidate and deepen the common sense revolution. That didn't have to be. I think we could have imposed a real defeat on the Tories. We could have created a situation where the ability of that government to proceed with its agenda was actually called into question. The mobilisation was important, but it didn't reach the levels it should have.
And this is the days of action you're talking about, right?
That's right. The days of action, and indeed, I mean, other struggles that were taken up at the same time as well. Some major strikes and what have you.
And so the days of action, one thing I learned recently is that one of the kind of significant developments was that people were engaging in cross-picketing. So people would be picketing workplaces other than their own to avoid legal repercussions, I guess, and huge marches through cities one at a time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's quite correct. I mean, I remember that at the time, and I personally was at every one of the days of action, and I remember that OCAP would always be, apart from the more far-flung ones where we couldn't get a sizable contingent out, OCAP would always be assigned a particular workplace where we'd be involved in the in the picketing of that place, where the union that was the union that represented the workers there wouldn't be present.
And so, why do you think the days of action didn't realize their full potential, as you say?
Well, I mean, there was never a clear articulation of the strategy behind them. They were bureaucratically run. The heads of unions would decide what the next move was. At the end of each incredibly powerful social mobilisation and vast rally that took place, you'd leave without knowing what was going to happen next. There were deep divisions within the union leadership over how far to proceed, and an almost unanimous view that they shouldn't go too far. They really reached a point where I think had they been escalated further, they would have actually been calling into question the ability of the Harris government to proceed with its agenda, and possibly actually challenging the ability of that government to govern. And I think the trade union leadership wasn't ready for the implications, the political implications of that kind of a move. But despite the vacillating, dithering approach that was taken, what was incredible was how long they were able to go on mobilising so many people so powerfully. Had the thing been organised and led in a different way, I think that a campaign of as powerful as those days of action were, something incomparably stronger and greater could have been put into place. I do believe that it was entirely possible that Harris could have been defeated.
Looking back now, do you feel like there's a clear lesson from that in terms of how to avoid that in the future, or is it just a matter of organizing more and better? Well,
I mean, it is a matter of organising more and better, but it's also a question of what the basic political perspective will be. And if the notion is that we don't want to go too far, but we hope we can, get the government's, we can tweak the government's conscience and make them reconsider what they're doing, then it's not going to succeed. There has to be a level of mobilisation, a form of mobilisation that can actually call into question the ability of a regime like that to proceed with its agenda. And unless there's a readiness to do that, there may be some powerful actions, but they're not going to be enough.
So after the days of action, I guess, did they sort of just peter out, or one just, they just kind of fell apart after a certain amount of time? How did OCAP decide to proceed after that?
Yeah, I mean, they did peter out. They were eventually abandoned. They were wound down and they were abandoned. And we realised that this was an incredibly unfortunate development. It made things so much worse. Because Harris now knew that he'd ridden out that protest period, and that he didn't have to face that anymore, and he could double down on his agenda. So we did try to redouble our efforts to try to give a lead, recognising that one small poor people's organisation couldn't compensate for the strength of the trade union movement and what have you. But we looked to do as much as we could to try to contribute to things, and there was the June 2000 march on Queen's Park that they later called the Queen's Park Riot, was sort of part of that. The march into the financial district a year later, in the Toronto financial district a year later, where we sort of shut down Bay Street, and the attempts to redoubling our efforts to build the Common Front were all part of that. And I think it was important that those struggles were taken up by us and other people, and that the movement of resistance to Harris didn't die after the days of action. But can't deny that the calling off of the days was a profound defeat that caused an awful lot of people an awful lot of pain and suffering.
In the province of Ontario, we have a premier who says, I don't do protests. I don't do anything that these special interest groups say that I should do. I don't give a shit if you put 250,000 people on the front lawn of the legislature. It means shit, because the people who live and the people who die in the street are considered to be a special interest group. Now, when we're told that, and the question's been raised about mass movement and the mass mobilization of people. If you can mobilize every person in the province of Ontario, it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be 75 people die in the streets of Toronto this winter. It doesn't mean that. So when we're confronted by a government that chooses not to respond in any way to public pressure that's through the normal course of the process, then as an advocate and as a participant in that process, you have to examine, how far am I willing to go?
You're listening to From Embers here on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston and podcasting online through your favorite podcast apps. Tonight we're speaking with John Clarke, who is a founding member and longtime organizer of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. What happened at the Queen's Park riot in June 2000?
Well, I mean, the Harris cuts had led to a situation where the number of people dying on the streets, the number of people homeless had exploded, and so we came up with a tactic that was used by the British unemployed movement in the 20s and 30s, but also here in Ontario in 1935, of going to a legislature and demanding the right to address it. So we had the notion of, or we issued the call that the homeless delegation should be allowed to address the Ontario legislature, and they said this was completely impossible. So we went there to try to achieve it. We'd expected that it was unlikely that we'd actually get a delegation to address the legislature, but we thought that it would be a high-profile event, and it was very possible that we could win something like a meeting with some of the cabinet ministers or something like that. But that win or lose, it would be win or lose in an immediate sense. It would take things forward, which indeed it did. What we hadn't anticipated was how brutally they would move to try to clear the grounds of the legislature. We thought that there would be some kind of a standoff situation and some kind of negotiated settlement, but what they actually did was brought in riot cops and horses and attacked the crowd, and there was a really brutal confrontation, and people fought back. There was a huge battle, and at the end of the day, there were multiple arrests, lots of people who were injured on both sides, and I think it galvanised people in many, many ways. It was a really important landmark event in the struggle against the Harris Tories, and it did a lot to keep the momentum of resistance alive. So in the years of OCAP's been organising probably one of the most important events.
And you were charged with some 1930s era sedition law or something like that at that time, weren't you? They identified three of us that they deemed to be organisers or leaders of the event, and we were charged with participating in a riot, and I was also charged with counselling to participate in a riot and counselling to assault police. And yes, I mean, the legal precedents for those kinds of cases did indeed go back to the 1930s. They were sort of public order offences that hadn't been used for a very, very long period of time. And there was a jury trial in which in the end, there was a hung jury, and they had to declare a mistrial. And then they decided they were going to have another jury trial for me, and we put forward a constitutional motion, an 11B constitutional motion, arguing that they had taken too long to bring the matter to trial, and we won that. So that was the end of it. Wow. And in the aftermath of the Queen's Park riot, there were some labor unions who decided to distance themselves from OCAP, and some of the funding was pulled. Is that correct?
That's partly true. There was talk of it, particularly the then CAW was there were concerns raised, but it wasn't actually the Queen's Park riot that led to that. It was later when we organised an action at James Flaherty's office. He was then the Finance Minister of Ontario. We went in and we threw his furniture out on the streets, and the then president of the CAW, Buzz Hargrove, defunded us over that. Although I must say the support we got from other quarters, including just ordinary working class people. I remember a retirement home in the Sioux. The residents took up a collection for us, and we got more money. But we got more money coming in from people who were outraged that Hargrove had defunded us than we actually lost from the funding cut that he imposed.
And then in 2001, there was the March on Bay Street, and it seems remarkable to me because October 2001 obviously is a month after the 9/11 attacks in New York, and a lot of street protest movements felt a lot of fear about going out into the streets. So was there a big debate about whether to continue with that action after the 9/11 attacks?
I mean, we rapidly decided that we were going to continue. We recognised the fact that the 9/11 that happened was going to be a huge problem, but we didn't feel we could cancel it. We were under big pressure from the authorities. I remember the chief of police had cops bring a letter from him to the homes of several of us who were organising the event, urging us not to proceed with it. But it went ahead, and it was extremely successful, and it really achieved its objectives. It was a great event, and it did show that even in that reactionary and fearful climate, it was still possible to organise something really effective. I remember I myself couldn't attend the event because I had bail conditions that prevented me from attending demonstrations, so I had to watch it on the television in the OCAP office. And I remember the high point of the thing was the deputy chief of police saying that OCAP had failed and would never get into the financial district, and then the thing cut away to the picture of the demonstration absolutely filling the financial district with people.
Another tactic that OCAP has used at times over the years has been public squatting, basically, and I think of the 2002 Pope squat in Parkdale. Can you talk a little bit about that as a tactic and how it led to the creation of social housing in Toronto?
Yes, I mean, some of the places that we did do takeovers. There was 8890 Carlton, which was right by the old Maple Leaf Gardens. That was turned into housing. And Pope Squat that was eventually turned into at least a private rental place. We did for a period try to take up squatting as a serious activity, and we did achieve some things. And the Pope Squat was held for I think about 3 months, and it was really good. But we also arrived at a situation where this is not like many European countries where there's some level of squatters' rights. To go and take an empty building is not in law regarded as any different to moving into somebody's living room, and so the authorities can remove you much more quickly. And the police had clearly arrived at the point where they were not going to allow us to take over an empty space, and they would move in rapidly. So the squatting tactic achieved some things, but it was not sustainable as a tactic. And the only way it could become sustainable is if it was organised on a much greater scale. There'd have to be a level of mobilisation that was too great for them to deal with. And with so many thousands of condominiums standing empty in the city of Toronto at the moment, being held for parasitic and speculative purposes, the possibility of building that kind of a large-scale housing takeover movement is perhaps back on the table again.
So then we had 15 years of Liberal rule under Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne. How did the conditions for OCAP being able to organize change with a Liberal government?
Well, they're difficult. I mean, coming from Britain, the thing that I soon realised that was really different about the Canadian situation is the fact that, unlike the UK, where the Liberal Party went into disappeared from view as a major political force in the early 20th century, the Liberal Party has remained a strong, dynamic, robust political formation. I don't say that with any satisfaction. And in Canada, and so the Liberals came in and played their classic role. In opposition, they had been the conscience of the Liberals, eclipsing sometimes the NDP with the effectiveness of their feigned outrage at what the Tories were doing. But when they came to power, they simply quietly and more sedately consolidated and deepened what the Tories had done, so that social assistance rates weren't cut in the way that Harris had done, but they were increased at levels below the rate of inflation. So people continued to get poorer, continued to get more desperate, continued to be forced more and more to take the lowest, most exploitative, most precarious jobs. So they deepened the thing. But they, being the Liberals, they also set up elaborate poverty consultation networks and proceedings, and were very effective at ensuring that they wouldn't face the same level of mobilisation and challenge that the Tories had. And they did a good job for 15 years. I can't deny. I've got to give them credit for the effectiveness of their techniques. But they were still challenged, and there was still mobilisation, and the fight was taken up, and we took up a whole series of fights against them ourselves.
Yeah, actually, it's sort of a tangent, but I remember years ago there was a satellite office opened up in North Etobicoke that was run by Somali Women's Collective. Is that still happening?
Yes, Somali. Yes, it was OCAP Women of Etobicoke, and it was entirely run by Somali women. With it was linked to the campaign I didn't get to mention, but was the fight for something called the special diet, a benefit that could be obtained if a medical provider deemed it necessary, getting more money for people on social assistance, and we organised on a very big scale. And the Somali community played a very leading role in that fight. So that initiative really was linked to and came to an end in many ways with the end of the special diet campaign. But we retain a lot of connections in the Somali community, and it was a really important period.
The special diet allowance was basically a doctor's discretion added top up to funding that OCAP mobilized to kind of get to everybody who needed it, right?
Yeah, we were actually looking at ways in which we could get money to people, because we weren't in a position to win an increase in social assistance rates, and we were looking for benefits that we could access, and came across the special diet and started organising clinics where we bring in sympathetic medical providers who would sign people up for the benefits. And then the incredible part about it was that once people got their forms filled in, they'd be rejected. And so it meant that if people wanted this benefit, they were going to have to fight for it. So we were organising these huge clinics and then mass actions to get the benefits for people. And it was enormously effective. The Auditor General reported that the benefit had gone from one paying $6 million a year to one paying $200 million a year. So we were getting lots of money to people, not just OCAP individually, but it was a spin-off where people in poor communities started accessing it and such like. But it led to a huge growth in the benefit, and they changed the rules to make it impossible to continue with the clinics and the campaign. But we did a freedom of information that showed that, in fact, while lots of people had their benefits cut off, overall access to the special diet had actually continued to increase after the campaign. So we did get millions, hundreds of millions of dollars back to people, and that was really significant.
And now we've got Doug Ford, who is a right-wing conservative government that many have tried to draw comparisons to the Harris regime, but of course we haven't seen the level of mobilization nor the level of kind of rapid, overt attack that people clearly recognized in the first year of Mike Harris. How do you think the Ford regime compares to the Mike Harris regime?
Well, they've done some very dangerous things. They are really quite vicious. Their attack on healthcare, for example, was enormous, and it also needs to be borne in mind that the social infrastructure is so much weaker today than it was when Harris took over. So Ford's cuts hurt a lot more and do a lot more damage than anything Harris could do. But it is true that they've been erratic. They've been dithering. They're not as decisive as the Tories of the Harris years. And it's also true that movements today are. I mean, I criticised some of the ways in which the days of action in the 90s weren't followed through with as they should have been. But the truth is that in terms of the strength of our movements today, we're probably weaker than we were at that time. Having said that, despite the fact that the immediate organisational possibilities are not impressive, there is out there an incredible mood of anger. And one of the things about this period, and as we talk, we're talking in a situation where there's a veritable global uprising going on against the neoliberal order. I think that can change very rapidly. we could have a situation where a very, very large mobilisation against the Ford government breaks out, and we have to work for that, and realise that we're in a really volatile period where things could happen on a scale that made what happened against Mike Harris look quite small.
What kinds of organizing do you find inspiring today in Ontario, and what kinds of things do you think people need to think more about doing? Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of exciting movements that have happened since the Harris years. We have mobilising by Indigenous people happening. Going, idle no more, the struggle that's being taken up in BC at the moment that's so pivotal and so vital. We've had anti-racism initiatives happening that just weren't around at that time. Particularly think of Black Lives Matter. We've had ongoing efforts to organise, despite the fact that unions have been generally weakened. This is a time when there's a sustained effort to organise in the gig economy. The Foodora workers here in Toronto and other examples of that. So there are real possibilities in terms of exciting new directions. But looking at the situation, I think there is also this unknown quantity of this. The World Bank and the IMF talk about it, that there's this volatile mood of anger that can break out in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of contradictory ways. So we're living in a period where real social explosions are possible, and our sort of formal concept of organising, incrementally to build movements gets superseded by people coming onto the streets that you never expected to see on the streets. The yellow vests in France. To distinguish them from the ultra-right crowd that have used the name here, there's all sorts of possibilities that are there today that weren't around at earlier times. Last year, you stepped down as organizer from OCAP, but pledged to stay involved as a member. And one thing I thought was nice about that was that people helped fundraise to get you a pension, which I think was a really good effort.
Yeah, that was much appreciated, and I mean, I mean, it's certainly in my own personal situation, it's good. But I also think that the work that I did was like many other people. I organised in a fairly precarious way without any sort of formal employee status and pension contributions and that kind of stuff. So our movements have to, I think, support those that have done that kind of work. I say it a little sheepishly because I'm talking about myself personally, but I think as a general point, it's also true.
And so, how have you been spending your time since just becoming a regular member of OCAP? Yeah, well, I mean, I still put a lot of time into OCAP itself, but I've been doing more. Sort of like speaking and writing type stuff. I've perhaps reached a time in life when I've learned some things, probably most of them from the mistakes I've made, but I've learned things that I can help convey. I was also offered and took, which has been really helpful and wonderful, a position at York University on the Packer Visitor in Social Justice at York University. So I'm teaching a course in social justice and using that to sort of promote social justice related scholarship and activism. And Jane Finch, which is a very poor neighbourhood close to York University, we're going to take that the course that I'm teaching in a modified way and run it in the Jane Finch community itself. So there's all kinds of sort of very interesting, exciting things going on, and I'm just looking to contribute to the movement in a slightly different way, but I hope an important one. Is there a clear strategy or campaign that OCAP is focused on right now?
We're dealing with the homeless crisis in Toronto and challenging that with the they must open space in terms of the shelters. There's an absolutely appalling situation going on that's getting worse and worse and worse. We've got a very particular campaign that we're taking up to try to win social housing right at the corner of Dundas and Sherburn. There's a large property, a building and an empty lot, and we're trying to get the city to expropriate it and build a social housing project on that very site. It will be important for the hundreds of people that will be housed there, but it's also important because it's a ground zero site in terms of the gentrification of the downtown east. And if we don't win social housing there, there's going to be another condo go up, and that's going to be in some ways the death knell in terms of the gentrification of the neighbourhood. So it's a really important fight. Ongoing fights against the Doug Ford government, but their brand of right-wing welfare reform, which they seem to be working on, is not. They're not clarifying their intentions in anything like the same way that the Harris Tories did in the 90s. So fighting them on the social assistance issue is a little less clear cut. However, this last year, they did not provide any increase whatsoever to social assistance, and food costs are going out of control. So, plus the fact that there's real possibilities that they're going to move on disabled people. The Auditor General is urging them basically to do so, and a major attack on disability benefits is also a real possibility in terms of coming out of the Ford government. So big battles that lie ahead, but as we said earlier, the single-minded competence with which the Harris Tories carried out their attack hasn't really been followed through by the Ford Tories to the same degree, which has complicated things somewhat.
Is there any one thing that you're thinking that we haven't talked about that we should really address, or anything you'd want to say?
Perhaps the only thing I would say is that the OCAP years have been marked by it's been a period where the neoliberal agenda has been going on internationally, and the last 10 or 12 years has been since the great financial crisis, where the neoliberal period was no longer an expansionary period, but it was a period in which things were very stagnant. There was a low-wage recovery. We weren't in conditions of recession, but at the same time, the low-wage sector was increasing and poverty was increasing. Now it appears that globally, conditions of economic downturn are beginning to emerge, and an economic slump in this situation is going to be absolutely incredible. I mean, to imagine a major recession breaking out with the Ford Tories in charge at Queen's Park is a sort of a doomsday scenario. So I think what we're going to see is a period that's where the attacks are going to actually intensify. And globally, there's this incredible sense of uprising that's taking place in place after place. People are taking to the streets and fighting back. So it may be that the period of OCAP so far has only been a preliminary, and we're going to be dealing with struggles in the years ahead that are on a much bigger scale.
If people want to find out more about what OCAP's doing, or to find some of your writing, where can people find that?
Well, they're welcome to if they want to just look at my writing or something, probably check me out on Facebook or something. I'm very easy to find. In terms of OCAP, probably drop an email at ocap@tao.ca, and when people in the office there will respond.
You've been listening to From Embers here on CFRC 101.9 FM, or maybe online wherever you get your podcasts. That was an interview with John Clarke about the history and philosophy of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty in Toronto. If you want to get in touch with us, you can always email fromembers@riseup.net. We would love to hear your feedback. All the music tonight is thanks to Bakunin's Bum, which is a project of Norman Naraki, and it features the voices of Sean Brandt and Sue Collis, who were both organizers with OCAP in the early 2000s. We'll be back next week with more anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice.
John has said, a revolutionary and anti-capitalist, essentially an uncompromising perspective. But at the same time, we seek and we continue to seek to find ways to affect people's lives daily as they are today. So what that means is that, while welfare would be something that overall we would fight, right, as a means of keeping people down, of a means of ensuring that vast segments of society simply don't have enough to live on. At the same time, we're able to deal as an organization when, as happens every single day, people come in who have been wrongfully denied assistance, who have been, for instance, told that they look too well fed not to be taking money from somewhere else and are cut off the rolls. Those kinds of situations when Immigration Canada wants to deport someone back to a country where they will be tortured, where they will be raped, where they will be murdered. We can deal with those situations. When someone is facing eviction, we can deal with that situation. And the way that we do that is simply to fight. When welfare cuts someone off, what we do immediately is send in a letter to the management of that office, laying out the grievances, laying out the time in which we want the situation rectified. And if they fail to act within that time, be it 24 hours, be it 48, be it 72, we organize a demonstration, a delegation to go down and take over that office until such time as that situation is worked out. To force a meeting with the management, to storm it, to create any, the degree of disruption that is necessary to deal with it. The same thing with Immigration Canada. We had a situation a year and a half ago, where a Somali woman with 5 children was living under a threat of deportation, a deportation order. We brought 120 people into that office, primarily from the Somali community, and brought people, with an understanding of what this woman was going to be facing, of what her children would be facing, and a will to do what was necessary to stop that. And I think that again is the key, is that 2 things. One is people have to see that an organization is able to deal with those daily realities, is able to deal with the fact that their kids are going to bed hungry at night. And also that an organization will deal with those things in a respectful, in an honest, in an integral, and in an uncompromising way. If we say that welfare is wrong, then we will go to the ends of the earth to make sure that thing doesn't happen. And I think that's key because people, in this community and poor communities everywhere, they really don't have the luxury necessarily of coming out and of talking about these things or about joining a march just to feel good about waving a picket sign around. I can't imagine, looking somebody in the eye who knows that their kid, is going to bed hungry or going to school without proper boots on their feet in the winter, and try to encourage that person to come out and partake in something that isn't going to lead to any substantive or real change. And I think that's the key, and that those things can run concurrently. It was said this morning that when you're looking to build, an alternative way of living, or alternative forms of government in society, or general alternatives, that doesn't come from nitpicking over what exactly that's going to look like. That comes through the process of fighting and action and bringing people up and instilling a sense of pride. Because there's nothing worse than a community or a neighborhood or just a personal feeling that there is no control, that people have no control, that they have no hope. And that's in the way we organize. That's the principal element that we want to instill. That there is hope and that there is pride, and that comes through standing up and fighting back.
listening to Dissident Island Radio.
Live every first and third Friday of the month at 9 p.m. GMT.
Check out www.dissidentisland.org for downloads and more.